Hi, thanks for signing up for this free course on how to become a better photographer. I am Sudhir Shivaram, founder and director of Sudhir Shivaram Photography Private Limited. Basically, an engineer by background, electronics and communications engineering, who worked in the software industry for close to 18 years. The first 9 years, I can say, more of a pure technical software programmer working at the device driver, kernel programming, that kind of a work, and the remaining part more into the corporate section of management level, I would say, of handling a software division itself. So I come with a pretty strong technical background, and on top of that, 25 years of photography. So I've been doing photography, and most importantly, I've been teaching photography for close to 15 years. And in the photography field itself, if I had to say some of my achievements, so I have been a Canon brand ambassador for close to 8 years. On top of that, the Sanctuary Asia Wildlife Photographer of the Year. And then, even with respect to National Geographic, I have won, or rather, my cover shot of this beautiful image has won the National Geographic Yellow Border Award. So, this cover shot featured in the National Geographic Traveler India, and then the internal competition within Nigeria across the 14 countries, and this won the first prize for India. Beyond that, when it comes to the recent Asian Photography Awards for 2017, I have been recognized and awarded as the third most influential person in the photography industry in India. So the first has been the Canon MD and CEO, the second has been the Nikon MD and CEO, and I have been at number 3. So when it comes to a photographer, probably the most influential photographer in India itself for 2017. And then again for 2016, I was placed at number 2. And then the year before that, I was placed at number 5. So the last 3 years consecutively, I have been rated as one of the most influential people in the photography industry itself. And then in the recent survey concluded, in the top 100 photographers on the web, the most talented, famous photographers on the web, I have been placed at number 12 across the globe. So number 1 in India, I would say. And then when it comes to wildlife photography across the globe in the top 100 list, I have been placed at number 1. So the awards and recognition, it goes on and on and on. So that basically gives me the confidence to teach, the kind of credibility I have. And that is where the big brands like Canon, Nikon, Samsung, Adobe, a lot of these big brands, they work with me because of the trust they have in me, with my capabilities, with my technical knowledge on photography and everything related to photography. So I've been conducting photography tours, workshops, all this for years together. And in the last 3 years alone, I have taught for more than 1,500 students. So I come with this very, very strong background when it comes to photography teaching. That's about me. Now let's come to the course itself. What is this course about? Now, in the next 40 minutes, I am going to teach you everything you need to know on the basic fundamental aspects of photography. Fair enough, you have bought your new camera and you look at all the various settings in the camera, doesn't matter, be it a Canon or a Nikon or a Sony or a Pentax or a Ricoh, the brand just does not matter. It's the concept which is more important. So you bought the camera, you look at the camera, the settings, it's way complicated. There are way too many buttons. In fact, if you see the current age digital cameras, they are very complex. The photography manual itself, if you see 200 pages, 300 pages, I don't expect you to go through those 300 pages to start operating this camera or how to become a better photographer. So in this course, what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you understand. If you look at the very basic things, what gets displayed at the back of the camera, I'm going to help you understand what each of those things are, how they impact photography, how you can start using that. So I'm going to teach you all those. Even though in the course I'll be using a Canon camera to explain the concept, it holds good for any brand of the camera. So what I want you to do is charge your camera completely and then hold the camera in your hand, go through the course one step at a time and start experiment along with me. And now comes another important point. Go at the end of the course. Once you finish the entire course, I want you to stick with me for the full course. That is very important. Once you finish the entire course, at the end of this course, I am going to give you some very, very useful information and tips. So don't cut it across. Stay till the end, go through it and hear what I have to say at the end of the course, which is where is going to be very, very important for you when it comes to your photography learning. And now comes another very, very important point. Now, as a part of this course, this is what, around 40 minutes of course. That's all. It's not a very, very big course. Now, if you look around, you have a lot of distractions. Your cell phone, your email is coming up, you have your Facebook or Instagram account, you keep looking at all those things. So, if you want to learn, if you want to be a better photographer, before you start this course, what I want you to do is switch off all those things. No distractions, nothing. You give me your undivided attention for the next 40 minutes, and I'll guarantee you, you are going to become a better photographer. Your understanding about photography will change like anything. So switch off all those things, pay complete attention to what I have to say as a part of this course, experiment along with me, and most importantly, as I said, at the end of this course, I have some very, very important information to share with you. Go through that as well, and then you can feel the difference in your images, and then you will be very happy looking at the images, the wow factor in the image, all those will start coming in. So let's get started with the course. Hi, in this tutorial, I am going to take you through the core concepts, the fundamental concepts of photography, and give you my recommendations so that you can start making some awesome images. The other good part about this tutorial is, like, I'll be conveying some of the settings, and in your camera you should be able to try it out and do the things practically along with me. So in the next 30 minutes, stay tight, follow the concepts, experiment along with me, and you will see the difference in your images, where you will understand what it takes to make those awesome images. So let's get started. I have currently connected my Canon 1200D, an entry-level camera, to the TV so that you will see the various displays, the settings, what the camera does, and you should be able to follow me. Now, as a beginner in photography, you don't have to go through very in-depth or any advanced settings or any of those things. Forget about all the various advanced features, whatever the camera supports. Let's get some of the very basics right. So for example, aperture. So since I'm shooting in aperture priority mode, the very basic exposure triangle parameters, be it your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, what are they, what impact it has on your image, we will see that. Next comes your exposure compensation, about when to underexpose, when to overexpose, make the image brighter or darker, what to do. Your picture style, what kind of picture style you should be using, we will look at that. Your white balance, so what is white balance, what kind of white balance you should be using, I'm going to help you understand those concepts. Next comes the other set of parameters, be it with respect to your shooting mode. So whether you want to shoot it in one shot mode, servo, depending on what is happening in your scenery, the focusing options we'll see, then even the metering. So what kind of metering you have to use, be it spot metering, evaluative. So what are those various metering options? And then of course, what kind of image quality you should be using. I'll be guiding you with that. And of course, the last point is obviously with respect to your focusing points, when to use what kind of focusing points. So here, this is the very basic thing, what you see in your Canon cameras. Now, the same concept applies to your Nikon cameras as well, where if you look at the info, the display what your Nikon camera gives, even that will have your exposure triangle parameters about aperture, ISO, shutter speed, the same things. Then you even have your compensation, exposure compensation, your white balance parameters, and in case of your focusing mode, whether it is like autofocus single, autofocus continuous, so what kind of focusing mode you want to use. Then comes even the metering, the concept is the same, and even your image quality, the RAW or the JPEG, what kind of quality you should be using, and then the focusing points. So if you see, be it Canon, Nikon or any brand, it doesn't matter. So let us go through each of these basic concepts and see what they are, what impact they have on the image, and what is the setting which you should be using to get some good images. As a first step, let us understand about the image quality. So here, as you can see from the display, in the info, you can press on the Q axis, the Q button at the back and access this, or you can go into the menu option. In that you have the image quality. If you go into the image quality, you have various options, right from the large to the medium to the small, and then you have a combination of RAW plus large and then just the raw. So here you are welcome to use any of this combination, and each of them, as you can see here, the resolution will vary. So if I keep moving, so as you can see, the resolution will keep changing, which is the print dimension if you are trying to print the images. So it's more to do with your megapixel, the resolution. So here, one of the main things is, as a beginner, I understand that raw probably may not be the right option because you may not be comfortable on how to process the raw images. So chances are you end up using just the JPEG. So but my recommendation would be to use a combination of raw plus large depending on the size of the memory card. So yes, please go ahead, buy a larger sized memory card so that you can store more images. Now, one of the key advantages of the raw file is even if you make minor mistakes in the field, be it with respect to the various settings, with respect to your white balance, exposure, so even with respect to the picture style, any of those various combination you make a mistake, still there are ways in which you can very easily fix if it is raw. Raw is very, very powerful. So go ahead, use the option of raw plus large and then keep that as your standard setting. If you look at your Nikon setting, even Nikon has something very similar where you can have a combination of NEF. So that is the raw format for Nikon, NEF plus the different options of JPEG. So go ahead, choose any of these things. But as I said, as a beginner, please go ahead with the combination of raw plus large, because in future, once you learn about raw processing, you can come back to these images and process the raw files. So go ahead, to start with, put the setting as raw plus large or NEF plus any of the JPEG option and keep that as your standard setting. Let us now understand the next important parameter, which is your white balance. So in case of Canon, I can access the white balance using the quick access button at the back by pressing Q and going into this, or I have a direct access button. Check your camera and you will have a direct access white balance. I click on that and you have this various parameters, various white balance setting rather. What is white balance? In simple terms, white balance is one of the key parameter which decides what kind of colors you want in your image. White balance is nothing but telling the camera to get a white color as a proper white depending on the lighting situation. Now white balance is expressed in Kelvin. So here if you see with respect to the white balance, for my Canon 1200D, I have all this various white balance setting. I have the auto white balance where the camera decides what kind of colors to put, what kind of Kelvin value to put depending on the lighting. Then I have the daylight. So daylight has an approximate value of 5200 Kelvin. Then I have the shade. Shade is approximately again 7000 Kelvin. I go further, I have the cloudy, which is 6000 Kelvin. Then the tungsten light, which is more of 3200 Kelvin. Then again the white fluorescent light. Flash, for outdoors, flash is in the range of 5400 Kelvin. And then the custom white balance. So depending on your camera model, you may have the advanced setting of the manual white balance where the K will be displayed and these values you can manually put it. Let's go each of this, let's look at each one of them. Now, when it comes to outdoors, if you use a white balance setting of anything about 5000 or below 5000 Kelvin, say for example, daylight, then tungsten or even fluorescent, any of these parameters where the value is less than 5000 Kelvin, you will get more of bluish cast in your image. So whereas same outdoor conditions, if you go into the option of say shade which is 7000 Kelvin, cloudy which is 6000 Kelvin, anything above 6000 Kelvin, you will get more yellowish colors in your image. Now let us look at this particular image. So this image has been shot outdoors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you like how by putting different white balance values, the colors of the image basically changes. So I'm going to just put it in auto mode. So auto, the camera decides, I have no control. Then if I'm going to put it in daylight at 5200 Kelvin, this is what I get. Then I move it from 5200 to 5400 Kelvin, which is more of your flash. Outdoor for flash is 5400. This is the kind of colors you get. Then I moved to cloudy, which is 6000 Kelvin. And then even with respect to shade, it is more of 7000 Kelvin, it goes up. On the other side, if I come where I put it for tungsten, which is 3200 Kelvin, as you can see, it is more bluish in color compared to the cloudy and shade which is more yellowish, more warmer colors. Even white fluorescent light also gives you more bluish color. So as you can see, white balance varies the colors in your image. My recommendation is do not go with auto white balance, because in case of auto white balance, the camera decides what colors to put. As a photographer, you need to be in control. You decide what kind of white balance you want to use based on the actual lighting situation. This is for Canon, and if you look at Nikon option, it is more or less the same, where the terminologies may vary a little bit, but the overall concept of using the white balance is the same. So as I said, as a beginner, my recommendation when it comes to the using the values for white balance, don't go with auto. Based on the lighting situation you use, whether you want to go with daylight or flash, or it is cloudy, or with respect to shade, those things. For indoors, probably it may be more of incandescent or fluorescent. Those options comes into picture. So go ahead, understand about white balance, take the camera, go out in the field, the same image what you have, go ahead and shoot that at various white balance, and you personally see what the difference is, and you decide based on the lighting what kind of white balance makes sense. So that's about white balance. Now comes the most important part of photography, which is your exposure triangle parameters of shutter speed, aperture and ISO. Let us study what these parameters are, what impact they have on the image, and what kind of settings you should be using. I am currently in the shutter priority mode of my camera, which is the TV mode for Canon and S mode for Nikon. So here what happens, as a photographer, I set the shutter speed. So let us look at what is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is the duration of time your shutter is open for the light to enter and hit your sensor. So if you look at the shutter speed, so a value of low shutter speed basically causes motion blur. If you are shooting handheld, the shake which comes into the image, that is because of slow shutter speed. Whereas if I take it up, so all the way I keep going, a higher shutter speed freezes action. So what does shutter speed do? Low shutter speed is responsible for motion blur or camera shake which comes because of handheld shooting. High shutter speed freezes the action. So if you look at this particular image, so this I have shot it at a high shutter speed, where you can see that the waterfalls, the overall action has been frozen. Whereas the same image, when I shot it at a very slow shutter speed of say 2 seconds, 4 seconds at that slow shutter speed, as you can see, it's more of a silky flow of water. So shutter speed is the duration of time the shutter is open, and then you can basically decide how you want to take that image. My recommendation when it comes to shutter speed, if something is totally static, if it's a person standing, not moving, it could be a landscape scene. So anything which is totally static, you don't have to worry too much about the shutter speed. And of course, for any beginners, as I recommend, always use a tripod to get a proper setting. Now that is about shutter speed. Now the other parameter, the next parameter which we have to understand is more to do with your aperture. For that, let me go into the aperture priority, which is the AV mode for Canon and then the A mode for Nikon. Aperture is basically one of the parameters. Now okay, first what is aperture? Aperture is the opening of your lens. So if you look at this particular lens, so this is basically the 1635 lens. Aperture is this opening. So how large our opening is. So even if you look at this particular image, so aperture basically has blades inside. So a smaller aperture, say if I go all the way down to f4, an aperture, a smaller f number basically means a very large opening of your lens. Whereas I move up all the way, I go to f16, f20, f22, that is a very small opening. A very small opening means less amount of light coming into the camera. So here if you can see, a smaller f number is a large opening, a larger f number is a very small opening. Now this again controls the amount of light entering your camera. So one of the key things about aperture is that controls the depth of field. Now depth of field is that area of your photograph which is in sharp focus. So this particular image here, if you see, the depth of field what we call is very shallow. I have used a very low f number, and that is where, as you can see, the depth of field is very shallow. Now the same image, if I move my aperture, the f number, if I make it very large, an f22 or like that, then as you can see, the same image, the depth of field is very large. That means large area of your photograph is in sharp focus. Now as a photographer, you have to decide where you want to use a shallow depth of field, where you want to use a larger depth of field. Now let me give you a quick tip over here. If more or less, if it is just one single subject what you are trying to shoot, in most situations a lowest f number supported by your lens will do. Whereas if there are more subjects one behind the other and you want all of them to be in sharp focus, then your f number you may have to increase. Now similar to the shutter speed, aperture is one of the parameters responsible for your depth of field. Your focal length of the lens, then camera to subject distance also comes into picture. But go ahead, use the aperture based on the scene, and as a photographer you decide whether you want a lower f number or a larger f number to get an appropriate depth of field. And then the third parameter, which is more of your ISO. ISO is nothing but the sensitivity of your sensor. So during our olden days when we used film, so there were basically chemicals in the film, and then that is what we called as the sensitivity of the film. So the ISO or the ASA, what we used to call, was more of how fast those chemicals can react to light. So in the digital cameras, it is more to do with your sensor. So how fast the sensor can react to light. That is what ISO is all about. Now, if you look at the ISO, whatever ISO you have in your camera, so if I go into the quick view option and go into the ISO here, as you can see, I have auto ISO, then 100, 200, I have different ISOs based on your camera model. Again here, I would recommend you all not to use auto ISO, because when you put it in auto ISO, the camera decides what value to use based on the other parameters. Not recommended. So you go ahead, play around with the ISO. So remember, if you increase the ISO, so chances are you will get more noise. What is noise in the image? So this particular image, if you see, I have shot it at a little bit lower ISO, and wherever there is dark shadow area, as you can see, the details quality is very good. Whereas the same scene, if I increase the ISO, so at this high ISO, as you can see, I zoom in that area, if you see those small grains, that is noise. So depending on your camera, a low ISO is always preferable. But again, depending on mid-range or high-end cameras, ISO value you can actually take it up. So these are the three very basic exposure triangle parameters. Now how do they work together? So let me give you an example. Now you have various modes in your camera. So let me go with the very basic one, which is the complete auto mode. So when you put your camera in complete auto mode, the camera decides all the three parameters. The camera decides, the camera doesn't know what scene you're shooting. Camera will take into account the amount of lighting, and then it will put its own value of shutter speed, aperture and ISO to give you a decent image. Probably that may not be what you want. Next comes, and of course, if the light is less, the camera will pull out the flash as well. The next is the P mode, which is the program mode. In program mode, so when I half press my shutter release, as you can see, for a given ISO, the camera decides both the shutter speed and aperture. Again, you do not have control. Of course, you can increase your ISO, you can also put it in auto mode. So if you increase your ISO, I click on ISO, I increase the value, and then again half press my shutter release button. So as you can see, again the values will vary. So you have no control on what happens. Camera decides the parameters. Now the other mode is basically the TV mode, which is the shutter priority mode, or for Nikon guy it is the yes mode. So when you put it in TV mode, as a photographer, you decide what kind of shutter speed you want for a given ISO, and when you half press the shutter release button, camera will give a particular aperture. Now remember, if the aperture is blinking, which is happening in this case, if the aperture is blinking, that means that is not enough for this very high shutter speed in this low light situation. So I'm in my studio, the lighting is very low. So this high shutter speed for this ISO is not enough. Aperture is not enough, it blinks. If I shoot, I'll get a dark image. So that is where I keep decreasing the ISO, and then it is still not enough. There you see, it's very dark in the room here. I go all the way down, and there you go. So at one point it stops blinking, and this is a good value. Of course, remember, if the movement is happening in the subject, you will get shake blur, okay, if you're especially doing handheld. So you have to watch out for shutter speed. So keep it in mind, if any movement is happening in the scene, then make sure to watch out for the shutter speed and try to keep a high shutter speed if you want to freeze the action, and then if you want to purposely induce a motion blur, go with the slow shutter speed. That is about TV mode or the yes mode. And then the other mode is AV mode, which is the aperture priority mode, and for Nikon guys it is the A mode. In case of aperture priority, as a photographer, you decide, let me take it all the way down, you decide what aperture you want for a given ISO, and when you half press your shutter release button, camera will give you a corresponding shutter speed. Now you vary your aperture, then the shutter speed will vary. So in case of aperture priority, as it says, the priority is more on aperture. You decide what aperture you want for a given ISO, camera decides the shutter speed. So this is more recommended when there is not much movement happening in your scene. If you are doing landscape photography or any of those areas of photography where your depth of field is more important than the shutter, in that case, go with your aperture priority. Then the other mode is basically the complete manual mode. This is a little bit advanced mode. For beginners, I would not recommend that, because you have to decide all the 3 parameters based on the metering and other complex things. Not recommended. Go with any of the other mode of aperture priority, shutter priority, or even for that mode, program mode also will work. And then the other set of mode in your camera, you have all these various portrait mode. So portrait mode, here if you see, the ISO will be auto, and then the default setting. So more or less, if you see portrait, the camera gives more emphasis to the depth of field. And then you have the landscape. So even in case of landscape, okay, it is more of, again, the default settings are the single shot, not the burst mode. And then again, the priority is given more for larger depth of field. In case of a portrait mode, the camera tries to give you a shallow depth of field. In case of landscape, it tries to give you a larger depth of field to give everything in focus. Then you have the close-up or the portrait mode. Again, in that situation, it is more of trying to give you a shallow depth of field. Then comes your sports, action photography. Action photography, as you can visualize or you can think, is more to do with action happening. You want to freeze it. So in this mode, camera is going to give you a faster shutter speed. Then the other one is stars, night photography. So in this night situation, is going to give you a long exposure. Now, depending on what kind of camera model you will have, these are some of the very basic kind of shooting modes what you have. So once you understand overall, so let me go back to the AV mode. So once you understand the combination of your shutter speed, aperture and ISO, then play around with the settings, and as a photographer, you decide what kind of setting you want. So my recommendation, again, let me repeat. So any of those genres where action is happening, movement is happening, you want to freeze it or you want to create a motion blur, go with the shutter priority and decide what kind of shutter speed you want. And then depending on whether you're shooting macro, close-up, portrait, landscape, anything static, still, where shutter is not of much concern, it is more of depth of field what you want, go with your aperture priority and decide what kind of aperture you want. In all these cases, please keep a tab on what ISO you're using, because a very high ISO will yield noise image. Okay, so these are the very basic settings what you have to keep in mind on the exposure triangle parameters, and then as a photographer you decide what you want and go ahead with those settings. Now comes the next interesting part, which is your focusing mode and the focusing points. Now again, if I go back to the display here, in your display currently I am in one shot mode. So even in case of Nikon, so you have the different kind of focusing modes. So let me go into this. So I'm going to press the quick access button, the Q, and go into that. Of course, so depending on your camera mode, in fact, even for me, I have the direct access button, which is AF button at the back. I press that, I go into the different autofocus modes. Now let us look at each of these autofocus modes. The first one is one shot in terms of Canon, and for Nikon guys it is AFS, autofocus single. Typically one shot mode is used for totally static subjects. So what happens in case of one shot mode is when you half press the shutter release button, you hear the beep. Of course you need to have the beep enabled in your menu options. Once you hear the beep, that means the camera has locked focus onto that subject. So even in this case, so if you look at my camera here, if I just loosen the camera here, the head, so I aim at a particular place, I half press it, I'm in one shot mode, say okay, and then depending on where I'm shooting, you have to be in the autofocus on mode. Okay, so once I press, I half press it, I hear the beep. Keeping it half pressed, even though I move the camera left and right, the focusing will be locked at that particular point. So this option is quite useful when it comes to locking the focus and then recomposing. Depending on you want to move the subject within your frame, one shot is obviously a good mode. So that is one shot in Canon and autofocus single in case of Nikon. Next comes let's look at the AI servo. So if I come to the last option, that is AI servo for Canon, and in case of Nikon it is AFC, which is autofocus continuous. Now as the name says, autofocus continuous, here what happens, you can keep the focusing point on the subject and keep moving the camera along with the subject. So typically AI servo or autofocus continuous is used in cases where the subject is moving. So any kind of moving action photography, any kind of situation where the subject is continuously moving, in that situation keep the camera in AI servo or autofocus continuous mode. In this case what happens, when you half press your shutter release button, the camera will be continuously focusing. It will not stop. So there is no concept of locking focus at that place. It locks the focus, but when you move the camera along the subject, it continuously focus. So as you can see, it is suitable for anything which is moving. Next comes the other middle one, which is AI focus, or for Nikon guys it is AFA, autofocus auto. Here what happens, so in this particular mode, if the subject is stationary, internally the camera will move to one shot. So in case of AI focus, if the subject is stationary, internally it will move to one shot and you will hear that beep sound. In case of AI servo, you will not hear that beep sound because it is continuously focusing. AI focus, internally it moves to one shot, or autofocus single, you will hear the beep. But then if the subject starts to move, of course in this situation you can again do the recomposition, keeping it half pressed, move the camera and then click. In case of AI focus, if the subject is still and then it starts to move and you move the camera along with the subject, internally it will move over from one shot to AI servo. So the continuous focusing will start happening. Now of course, if you look at the situation, you feel that this is probably the best option and we should use it as a beginner. But my recommendation is don't go with this option, because there are certain situations where it takes time for the camera to detect that yes, the movement has happened, subject has started to move, and this switch over from one shot to servo or from autofocus single to autofocus continuous, there may be a lag, there may be a delay, and you may miss those important shots. So my recommendation is go with either one shot for totally static subjects, macro photography, landscape, portrait you're doing, close up. So any of those, product photography, fashion photography, portrait, so monuments. Okay, so any of these things go with one shot, and AI servo or autofocus continuous go in those situations where there is continuous movement happening, somebody running, car race happening. In case of wildlife photography, action, any of those things, go with AI servo. So this is more about the focusing mode of the camera. Next comes the focusing points. So if I come out of the screen, so if I press, of course in Canon the rightmost button at the top, and even in case of Nikon you have the button at the front depending on your camera model, where you can choose what kind of focusing points you want. So in my Canon 1200D, if I press on the focusing points, you will see all these various focusing points. Now this is where you will have to decide, and my recommendation again here is do not enable all the focusing points, because what happens is these focusing points are responsible for getting the subject in focus. Now if you enable all the focusing points, what happens is the camera decides where and how to focus, or on what subject within your frame it has to focus. based on how much light is falling on the subject, based on the contrast of the subject, the camera decides. So that is obviously not a good option, because if there are two people standing one behind the other, you want to focus at the front person, chances are if it's not properly lit, the camera will focus at the back person which is more lit, and that is not what you want. So avoid enabling all the focusing points, and you decide. So move your options around, and based on how you want to compose, you go ahead, move the focusing left, right, wherever you want to focus. And honestly speaking, the center focusing point is basically the most powerful one, which is the fastest, which basically focuses on the subject very fast. So go with the center focusing point for faster focusing even in low light situation. Concept is the same even in case of Nikon. Now, even depending on your camera model, the number of focusing points also will vary. So depending on the number of focusing points, you can decide as to, like, from a composition, where you want to move, how you want to move the focusing points. Okay. So again, as I said, avoid enabling all the focusing points, go with one focusing point and manually move it around depending on how you want to compose. So that is more about the focusing mode of the camera, and then using different focusing points on how to compose the image. So remember, you go ahead, you decide what kind of composition, what kind of focusing mode you want, put those parameters in the camera and then take it forward. Now comes the most complex part of photography, which is metering. Now, metering is quite interesting, and that is actually the heart of photography, based on which the exposure triangle parameters are decided. Now, be it Canon, Nikon or any camera model, the concept is again the same. Here what I am going to do, again I use the quick access button on my Canon camera, and then come down and go into the metering. So there you go. Now, metering, there are different kind of metering options. This is the entry level Canon 1200D, so where the spot metering is missing, but here we have evaluative metering, or in case of Nikon, it is called as the matrix metering, or we also call it as the multi-segment metering. Then partial metering, same in Nikon as well, the center weighted average metering, and then this option, if you see, this is basically spot metering. Now let us understand what each of these metering option does. Now, one step back, what is metering? The whole concept is, now if I am in aperture priority mode, okay, so I am basically at an aperture of, let's go down to say f4. So for an ISO of 1600 at f4 in aperture priority mode, when I half press the shutter release button, I get a particular shutter speed. So that value of shutter speed is decided by what kind of metering mode I am in. Now, in simple terms, for you all to understand, metering is nothing but it's more to do with the amount of light which is reflected from the subject. So the camera calculates how much light is reflected from the subject, and to give you a very basic exposure, to give you a exposure where it's not very dark, where it is not very bright, it will give you the shutter speed of 1 by whatever. So that is metering. Okay, so based on various metering options. Now when it comes to spot metering, what the camera does is, when it comes to your focusing point, you see this centered focusing point, what happens is the camera, when you look through the viewfinder, wherever the center focusing point is aiming at, camera calculates the amount of light over there, how much light is getting reflected from that, and it will give you a decent exposure, not very bright, not very dark, okay, a medium exposure, what we call, based on that amount of light being reflected from that center focusing point. Of course, there are options where you can move the focusing point and make sure you take the reading from there, but let's not get into that. So in simple terms, in terms of spot metering, wherever the center focusing point is looking at, camera sees how much light is reflected, and then based on that, it is going to give you a particular shutter speed. Now this is where, if you look at that image, it will give you a decent medium exposure. Now this is where your exposure compensation comes into picture. So in my Canon camera, I have the plus minus button. Even in Nikon, you have the plus minus button. Find out how to access the exposure compensation button in your particular model. I press it, and then the dial, if I move it around, there you go, it becomes darker or brighter. If I go into the quick access mode, into the exposure compensation, there you go, see there, I move it to the left, the image becomes darker. If I move it to the right, the image becomes brighter. At this point, auto exposure bracketing, keep it aside. So, darker or brighter. So, this is where as a photographer, you have to decide. The camera will give a decent medium exposure. Looking at the scene, if you feel you need to cut down light, you can make it darker. You want to get in more light, you can make it brighter. So, that is about the exposure compensation metering using the center focusing point, which is the spot metering. Now, let us go into the other options of metering. Now, the other one is evaluative metering, or for Nikon guys, it is the matrix metering or even multi-segment metering. So, in this case, what happens? It doesn't take it from the center at all like spot metering. Okay. So, here it's the evaluative or matrix, that means, or the multi-segment. That means what the camera does is basically takes the average of the whole scene. So, it divides the entire segment. So, how much light is basically coming into the camera from the entire scene, not at that one single point. So, from the entire scene, how much light is coming into the camera, it will calculate, it will average it out, and then it will give you a medium exposure. Same again, use the exposure compensation to make it darker or brighter. That is evaluative. Next, the other metering is basically partial metering. The third one is partial metering. Partial metering is very similar to your spot metering, where again from the center focusing point what you have. So, typically in spot metering, the center focusing point is an area of around 2 to 3% compared to your entire frame. Whereas partial metering, it takes a value about 12 to 13% of that focusing point at the center. That is about your partial metering. And then the last one is the center weighted average metering. So, here what it does, it gives more emphasis to the center portion of the image, how much light is reflected from the center portion of the image, and then it gives you a particular shutter speed to give a medium exposure. So, this is what metering does. Now, the overall complexity of the metering is quite high. So, what I would recommend you as a beginner, my recommendation is to go with evaluative metering. Okay, so currently go with evaluative metering mode. So, obviously in case of Nikon, it is multi-segment or matrix metering what we call. And then what you have to do as a photographer, look through the viewfinder, see the tonality. So, one of the key things is about tonality, what you have to look at. What is tonality? Nothing but darkness or brightness. Okay. So, if you look at the TV display here from a tonality, this is dark. Whereas this shirt, if you see from a tonality, this is more bright. The backdrop, the screen here, if you see tonality, it is dark. So, from a metering point of view, as a photographer, don't look at colors, but look at it from a tonality. Is it dark? Is it bright? Now, let me give you a very quick tip over here. Okay. So, when it comes to your evaluative or matrix metering or multi-segment metering, what kind of exposure compensation to use? Okay. So, that a quick tip, if I have to go into this, is basically if you are shooting something very dark, if the overall average tonality of the whole scene is dark, then you have to underexpose. Okay. So, of course, it's a little confusing where if the tonality is already dark, why should I again underexpose? Of course, that's because the camera, it doesn't make a dark image as dark, it will make it as a medium exposure. Okay. So, that is where to recover or to get back the dark tonalities, you have to underexpose. So, if you are shooting something bright, make sure you basically overexpose. So, keep it very simple. If you go into this again, if you are shooting something dark, you underexpose. If you are shooting something bright, you overexpose. By how much? That by trial and error, by experimenting over a period of time, you are going to learn it. So, as I said, my recommendation when it comes to metering is to make sure use evaluative metering or multi-segment matrix metering, and based on the tonality, go ahead, underexpose or overexpose. So, what I would recommend you is take your camera, get out into the field and then use these options. Okay. So, don't try to experiment with every single of the metering option. Try to master one particular metering option, understand it in depth, and then continue to the next one. So, put your camera in matrix or evaluative or multi-segment metering, same scene. Okay, put it on a tripod, put the camera on a tripod, same scene, shoot it with your exposure compensation at 0. So it doesn't matter whether you're in AV mode, TV mode, so obviously the corresponding value the camera will give you. Okay, it's okay, go ahead with AV or the A mode, then go ahead, same shoot it at 0. Then if you feel that the overall tonality, the average tonality is more on the darker, try to underexpose. You see these dots over here, try to underexpose by each dot. So one step, two steps. So keep underexposing one step at a time, the same scene, then again get onto the other side. So the best way to learn as a beginner is to experiment, and don't experiment on different scenes. That's another important point. Experiment on the same scene with different values. Make a note of it. And of course, the very good point is the EXIF information is available in your camera. Come back, copy it to the computer, and then keep looking at each image and see what is it that you have done. And that is how you can master the whole concept of metering, and you decide, depending on the situation, what kind of metering, what kind of exposure compensation you want to use, and then decide. So that's the best way to learn. Experiment one step at a time and then master the concepts. Good luck with metering. All right, so in the last 40 minutes or so, I have explained to you some of the very basic fundamental concepts of photography. Honestly speaking, these are the core things which you need to know as a beginner in photography. There are a lot of advanced things that is for later, but get these fundamental concepts right. So to conclude or to summarize what is it that you have to be doing, the main thing, obviously, what kind of image quality, as I said, go with the combination of raw plus large. And then comes obviously your white balance setting. So avoid the auto white balance, go with the white balance based on the lighting situation, and then go with that particular preset, or if you have the manual white balance, go with that particular manual white balance. And then comes your exposure triangle parameters. Shutter speed, freezing the action, motion blur, handshake, those things comes into picture. Your aperture, the depth of field comes into picture. And then obviously your ISO is to do with noise. Obviously this whole combination you have to get it right based on what kind of metering you use. So depending on the metering what you use, this combination comes into picture. And then the exposure compensation, making it darker, making it brighter, depending on the tonality, that you have to keep it into consideration. And then the other very important aspect is regarding the focusing. So with respect to your focusing options, whether you want to use one shot or autofocus single, AI servo or autofocus continuous, this is for static subject, this is for subject which is moving. Combination of both is AI focus, but as I said, my recommendation is avoid that. And then the other important point obviously is your focusing options. So what kind of focusing points you want to use? Be it Canon or Nikon, you have different kind of focusing points. Understand what those are, and for composition you will have to move the focusing points around, decide what is it that you want to do. So if you look at all these various combinations, this is the very basic. And the other one which I actually skipped is more to do with your picture style, and honestly speaking, don't worry too much. My recommendation is to go with the standard. In case of Nikon, you have your vivid, which gives you more vibrant colors, even the standard is there. Even in case of Canon, you have the landscape mode where you get a little bit more vibrant colors. So again, picture style is again more to do with what kind of photography you're doing, what you're shooting. And as I said, if you're shooting raw mode, then you can change those picture styles at a later point of time during post-processing. So these are the very basic fundamental concepts of photography. Experiment each of these things, learn the concepts by heart. Of course, no need to by heart anything over here. It's more of experimenting, understanding, and hopefully this session what I just gave it to you, hopefully you're going to like make use of it, practice, experiment, and then once you master this, then comes the advanced session, and that's for a later point of time. So good luck with your learning and good luck with your photography. All right, welcome back. So I am sure like you had a fantastic session going through all the various concepts. Pick up your camera now, start clicking those amazing images. But as I said, what you just saw, the course what you went through is just the tip of the iceberg. So as a part of the portfolio of services what I offer on my website, so online video tutorials is one of the very, very important things. So of course, like if you look at the various courses which are available on my online tutorials, the first important one is the basics and advanced photography course along with post processing. Now this itself is a very, very huge chapter where I take you through all the fundamental concepts, the advanced concepts, connecting the camera to the TV screen, what you went through, what you saw, and then I take you out into the field and practically show you how to basically implement that. So all those various fundamental things and even the advanced concepts I teach you over there make you perfect in all those things. And then of course at the end of that session you will understand as to what it takes to become a very, very good photographer. And then you can experiment it out there, those things hands on, you can try it out. It doesn't end over there. Then comes the other very important aspect, which is post processing. So if you look at the overall photography, it's just not about understanding about your camera, how to take good pictures. Fine, you got the images, you copied it to your computer. Next what? So how do you basically present those images? Even if you have to go to a party, I mean, you just don't get up and then just get off to the party. You make sure you are in a presentable situation. You go do, you freshen up, you have bath, whatever, shave, makeup, little bit of combing. So basically it's the same you, but you make yourself more presentable. So how do you do that to your images? That is where the post processing tutorials comes into picture. And as a beginner in photography, again, as I said, be it a Canon user or Nikon user, just does not matter. So I have targeted post processing tutorials right from using the very basic Adobe set of products using Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw to process your raw files. If you are a Canon photographer, I have the Canon DPP Digital Photo Professional course for you, online learning. If you are a Nikon shooter, then I have the Capture NXD tutorial as well. Depending on what kind of photographer you have all these various learning tools available at the tip of your hand or at the tip of your mouse. Just online learning, you can just follow through and learn photography. So once you finish your basic course, once you understand about all the post-processing concepts, all those things, next comes the other thing. Fine, if you want to buy a new camera, upgrade your camera, what is it that you should be doing? So I have a separate course on that, your ultimate guide to camera and lens buying. So equipment buying, what is it that you need to watch for? I have that separate course for you so that you can become a master expert in basically understanding what it takes to buy your next camera or upgrade your camera. And of course, like if you are a very, very entry level photographer, a beginner, the course what you just went through, the free course about how to become a better photographer, a little bit next step on that is basically an entry level course called as how to make better images from the Canon 1200D. So a Canon 1200D, if you are having an entry level camera, how to get started, be it Canon or Nikon, it just does not matter. So you can go through that course. And then comes a little bit of advanced course. If you are a Nikon D500 shooter, if you have a Nikon D500, then your ultimate guide to making really good images out of that Nikon D500. I have a huge entire course dedicated for that. So all these things, if you see each one of them step by step, you can start learning. All these are online based video tutorials what I offer. Okay, so of course, as I said, it's a combination of classroom as well as basically the field learning. In fact, I asked my friends, once I came up with all these things, I asked a few of my friends saying like, see, this is what I offer online. Okay, and then like, what do you think? So what kind of cost do you think you're willing to pay for this? So they said, Sudhir, I think if you look at this whole gamut of learning what you have put online, easily people should be able to pay 10,000 rupees. That's close to 150 US dollars. So this is what we are willing to pay for this kind of an offer what you have, online learning. And I said, okay, fantastic, that's good. They were, okay, Sudhir, what is the offer you're giving it at? I said, hold on, let me finish the whole story. So you sign up for my video tutorials, you go through all these various courses, you become a better photographer. Just imagine, obviously you can start creating amazing images, fantastic pictures you can start clicking from whatever kind of camera what you have. And then even once you become an expert shooter, move to the pro level of shooting. Look at the kind of applause you will get from your friends, family, colleagues at office. Nowadays, if you see like even at office, photography is such a kind of a hobby for everybody, that you start making good images you can share with your friends, and like you get that happiness out of that. So you can become that fantastic photographer. No more looking at others' camera and seeing like, I mean, how is it that he's able to make very good images? I have the same kind of camera. I am not able to get those images. None of those things. So say goodbye to all those things and then start making your own fantastic images. So if you see all the various things, the kind of future things what you can expect from these tutorials, I believe that 10,000 rupees is just a steal. Easily you should be able to afford. Again, hold on, it doesn't stop there. Once you subscribe for this video tutorials, it's a 1-year subscription period what you have. Once you sign up for this video tutorial, subscribe to it, then you become part of the Sudhir Shivaram photography community, the SSP community. I have a separate dedicated Facebook group just for my video tutorial subscribers. Nobody else has access to that. Only you folks will be part of that, and then there you can post your photographs. Me along with my team, and then other photographers who are there. Already like hundreds of photographers are part of that community. You come in, you start posting your images over there. You can start getting feedback, critics about your images on how you have to improve or what are the things you have to do to improve. And me, I'm going to personally handle people over there. Okay, even reviewing your images, help you build your portfolio. So we have the album concept where you start building your own portfolio, start improving on your photography. So the learning continues. It's just not the end after you sign up and watch the videos online, you learn photography. It doesn't end there. The learning continues within the private photography group, our own community. And then again, as a part of that private community, I'll be doing very regular Facebook live broadcasts. So a lot of people are already aware about my Facebook photography chat, which I do. The live broadcast is extremely popular. In the last couple of years, more than 4 million people have viewed those free online Facebook broadcasts. So for your group, it's going to be a specified, more private one just for the video tutorial subscribers. And then I'm going to be teaching some of the advanced concepts, clarifying your doubts on photography. So all the various tutorials you would have gone through, I'm going to give all the answers to the various doubts what you have, guide you through photography. And then apart from that, even when it comes to competitions, so I'm going to guide you as to like, okay, what kind of images you have to submit for the competition. What are the things the judges basically look for in the competition. So all these various things, again, I'm going to handhold as a part of that SSP community on Facebook. So it's just our own Facebook group. If you see the kind of benefits what you have, all these various things, this is where I think 10,000 rupees is absolutely easy go on that. That said, now comes the surprise element. The cost of this entire package is not 10,000 rupees. All this for a limited time period, I'm going to give you an offer of just 4,997. That is all it costs. This entire thing, if you see, right from the various basics and advanced photography tutorial what you have, advanced post-processing what you have, your ultimate guide to basically camera lens buying, that guide, post-processing using the Adobe set of tools, Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw, Capture NXD, then even Canon DPP, and then even the Nikon D500, how to basically make good images from that, the 1200D for beginners, all these various tutorials what you have for online learning, then our own private Facebook community, our own SSP community to learn photography, take it forward, the live broadcast, a lot of this bundle. If you look at the whole gamut of services what I offer, all this at a steal away price of just rupees 4,997. So what are you waiting for? The link is right down here. Go ahead, click on the link, explore the various tutorials, sign up for that, and I'm going to see you on the other side in our own SSP community. So don't wait any longer. As I said, this is going to be a limited time offer. Go ahead, sign up and start learning photography, and I'm going to help you become a better photographer. That's my guarantee.